Chapter 1, The Hunt Begins. Rain hammered the concrete as Seraphina pressed her back against the alley wall, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The footsteps were getting closer, heavy boots splashing through puddles, hunting her like prey. She clutched the stolen flash drive tighter, knowing the encrypted files inside could destroy the most powerful man in the city. But Marcus Blackthorne had found her first. Her ex-husband's voice echoed off the brick walls. "You can't hide forever, little mouse. You belong to me." The metallic scent of danger filled her nostrils as shadows moved at both ends of the narrow passage. She was trapped. A figure stepped into the dim streetlight, tall, predatory, with eyes that seemed to glow amber in the darkness. Not Marcus. Someone else entirely. Someone whose presence made her skin tingle with electricity she didn't understand. "You're in my territory," the stranger said, his voice like velvet over steel. Without thinking, Seraphina launched herself toward him, her arms wrapping around his solid frame as if he were a lifeline in a storm. She felt his muscles tense beneath her touch, heard his sharp intake of breath. "Please," she whispered against his chest, "help me." The stranger's arms came around her instinctively, and she felt safer than she had in months. His scent, pine and midnight air, made her dizzy. Behind them, Marcus's footsteps halted. "Who the hell are you?" her ex-husband snarled. The stranger's grip on Seraphina tightened protectively, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made the very air vibrate. "Someone you don't want to cross." She looked up into those impossible amber eyes and saw something wild flickering behind his human mask. Something dangerous. Something that made her heart race for entirely different reasons. Marcus backed away, his usual confidence cracking. "This isn't over, Sarah. You're mine, and everyone in this city knows it." The threat hung in the air like poison, but the stranger's presence seemed to shield her from its full impact. As Marcus disappeared into the shadows, Seraphina realized she was still pressed against this mysterious man's chest, still breathing in his intoxicating scent. She should pull away. She should run. Instead, she found herself looking deeper into those eyes that seemed to hold secrets darker than the night itself. "What's your name?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating his face for a split second, sharp cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it was carved from stone, and those eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Kieran," he said simply. "And you just became the most interesting thing to happen to me in a very long time." Thunder crashed above them, and Seraphina felt her world shift on its axis. She didn't know that Kieran Nightshade was the most feared alpha in the supernatural underworld, or that her desperate embrace had just marked her as his in ways she couldn't begin to understand. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. 6 months earlier, Seraphina had been a different person entirely. She remembered standing in the marble foyer of the Blackthorne mansion, her designer dress torn, her lip bleeding from Marcus's latest lesson about respect. The golden picture frames held images of their perfect life, charity galas, business dinners, a wedding that had felt more like a corporate merger than a celebration of love. But behind every smile in those photos was a woman slowly dying inside. Marcus had controlled everything, her clothes, her friends, her every breath. The day she'd finally gathered the courage to leave, he'd locked her in their bedroom for 3 days without food. Escaping had been a miracle wrapped in terror. She'd fled with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to disappear forever. For weeks, she'd moved from shelter to shelter, sleeping in her car when even those safe havens felt too exposed. Marcus's private investigators were everywhere, in coffee shops, outside job interviews, watching from black sedans that seemed to materialize whenever she thought she'd found peace. The divorce papers sat unsigned on his desk like a threat. "Till death do us part," he'd whispered during their last conversation, and she knew he meant it literally. The flash drive had been her Hail Mary, months of secretly photographing documents, recording conversations, gathering evidence of Marcus's illegal business dealings. Money laundering, human trafficking, connections to underground fighting rings that left bodies in their wake. She'd planned to trade the information for her freedom, but somehow he discovered her plan. Now she was running for her life through rain-soaked streets, carrying enough evidence to topple his empire. The weight of it pressed against her ribs like a loaded gun, and she wondered if she'd live long enough to use it. Working at Moonrise Cafe had been her attempt at normalcy, a quiet job in a part of the city where Marcus's influence supposedly couldn't reach. She'd lasted exactly 3 weeks before his men found her. The memory of that morning still made her hands shake, the black SUV parked across the street, the way her manager's eyes had gone wide when she'd begged for the back exit key. She'd left her entire life behind again, her small apartment, the coworkers who'd almost felt like friends, the first sense of peace she'd known since leaving her husband. Tonight, as she'd crouched in that alley with nowhere left to run, she'd prepared to die. The sound of approaching footsteps had felt like a countdown to her execution. Then Kieran had appeared, this enigmatic stranger whose very presence seemed to shift the balance of power in her favor. Even now, hours later in the safety of his high-rise apartment, she couldn't shake the memory of how right it had felt to be in his arms. He'd given her dry clothes and hot tea, but kept his distance, watching her with those amber eyes that seemed to catalog every breath she took. Something told her that jumping from Marcus's fire into Kieran's mystery might be the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. Chapter 2, The Alpha's Territory. Kieran's penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of Obsidian Tower, a gleaming black spire that dominated the city skyline like a dark crown. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the urban sprawl below, but Seraphina felt more like she was in a luxurious cage than a sanctuary. Everything was sleek, expensive, and intimidating, from the polished marble floors to the artwork that probably cost more than most people's houses. Kieran moved through the space with predatory grace, his every step silent despite his imposing size. When he handed her a steaming mug of tea, their fingers brushed, and she felt that same electric jolt that had nearly brought her to her knees in the alley. "Your husband," Kieran said, settling into a leather chair across from her, "owns half the police force and most of the judges in this city." His voice was matter-of-fact, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "That's why running to the authorities would be suicide." Seraphina's blood ran cold. She'd hoped the flash drive would be enough to bring Marcus down through legal channels, but if Kieran was right, she'd been naive to think the system would protect her. "How do you know so much about him?" she asked, noting how Kieran's jaw tightened at the question. "I make it my business to know about men who hurt what belongs to them." The way he said "belongs" made her shiver, though she couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else entirely. Kieran rose from his chair with fluid movement, pacing to the window where the city lights painted him in shadows and gold. "You can't go back to your old life," he continued, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Marcus will never stop hunting you. Men like him see women as possessions, not people." The bitterness in his voice suggested personal experience, and Seraphina found herself wondering what demons lived behind that perfectly controlled exterior. When he turned back to her, his eyes seemed to glow in the dim lighting. "I can offer you protection," Kieran said, moving closer until she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "But it comes with conditions." The air between them crackled with tension, and Seraphina felt her pulse quicken. She was acutely aware of how small she felt next to him, how his presence seemed to fill the entire room. "What kind of conditions?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kieran's smile was sharp as a blade. "You stay here. You don't leave without my permission. And you trust me completely, even when you don't understand why." It sounded like another form of captivity, but somehow, the thought of being under Kieran's protection didn't terrify her the way Marcus's control had. Thunder rumbled outside, and rain began pelting the windows with renewed fury. Kieran's apartment felt like a fortress suspended above the world, isolated and impenetrable. "Why would you help me?" Seraphina asked, setting down her tea with trembling hands. "You don't even know me." Something shifted in Kieran's expression, vulnerability flickering across his features before being quickly masked. "Because I know what it's like to be hunted," he said quietly. "And because something about you." He trailed off, his amber eyes searching her face as if looking for answers to questions he couldn't voice. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken promises and dangerous possibilities. 3 days in Kieran's penthouse felt like living in a beautiful prison where the warden happened to be devastatingly attractive and utterly mysterious. Seraphina had explored every room she was allowed to enter, the library with its leather-bound books and rolling ladders, the state-of-the-art kitchen where Kieran prepared meals with surprising skill, the guest bedroom where she slept fitfully while trying not to think about him just down the hall. But there were locked doors, rooms he steered her away from with polite but firm redirections. The man was a puzzle wrapped in expensive suits and amber eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. Kieran left for hours at a time, conducting business he never explained, returning with tension radiating from his shoulders and darkness clouding his features. He'd shed his jacket and roll up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked with scars that looked too precise to be accidental. Sometimes she caught him staring out the windows with an expression so haunted it made her chest ache. Other times, she'd turn around to find him watching her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could read every secret written on her soul. The attraction between them was a living thing, growing stronger each day despite her attempts to ignore it. On the 4th night, Seraphina woke to the sound of Kieran's voice echoing from somewhere deeper in the apartment. She followed the sound down a hallway she'd never explored, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. Through a partially open door, she glimpsed him in what appeared to be a home office, speaking in low, urgent tones to someone on the phone. "The borders are secure," he was saying, "but Marcus is getting desperate. He's reaching out to the Raven Pack for mercenaries." Pack. The word sent ice through her veins. She pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more. "I don't care what it costs," Kieran continued, his voice taking on an edge that made her skin prickle. "Double the patrols. If any of Marcus's men enter our territory, I want to know before they take their next breath." There was a pause, then, "Yes, she's still here." "No, she doesn't know what we are yet." Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. What they were? Before she could process the implications, Kieran's voice dropped to a growl that definitely didn't sound human. "Anyone who tries to take her from me will learn why they call me the Night Alpha." The phone clattered onto the desk, and suddenly the apartment fell silent. Seraphina backed away from the door, her mind reeling. Night Alpha. The words echoed in her head as she stumbled back to her room, pieces of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. The way Kieran moved with predatory grace. His uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived. Those amber eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. The scars on his arms that looked like claw marks. Her hands shook as she sank onto the bed, wondering if she'd escaped one monster only to find sanctuary with another. But even as fear crept up her spine, she couldn't forget the gentleness in his touch, the way he'd held her in that alley like she was something precious and fragile. Whatever Kieran Nightshade was, he'd become her protector, and possibly the most dangerous man she'd ever met. The next morning brought news that shattered their fragile peace. Kieran's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Raven who moved with military precision, delivered the update while Seraphina nursed her coffee and tried to pretend she hadn't been eavesdropping the night before. Marcus Blackthorne hired the Bloodclaw mercenaries, Raven reported, her voice clipped and professional. They've been asking questions at every hotel, shelter, and safe house in the city. 3 locations were compromised last night. Kieran's grip on his coffee mug tightened until Seraphina worried the ceramic might shatter. The muscle in his jaw twitched, and for a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped to reveal something feral underneath. How many? Kieran's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded violence. Raven's expression darkened. 6 mercenaries dead. 2 of ours injured but stable. The casual way they discussed death made Seraphina's blood run cold, but it was Kieran's reaction that truly terrified her. His eyes flashed gold, not amber, but pure molten gold, and the air around him seemed to shimmer with barely contained energy. Marcus is escalating, he said, rising from his chair with fluid menace. He's willing to start a war to get her back. The way he said her made it clear that Seraphina had become the center of something much larger and more dangerous than a domestic dispute. Kieran turned to face her, and the intensity of his gaze made her feel like prey being stalked by an apex predator. I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me enough to answer honestly. His voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath the silk. Has Marcus ever mentioned anything about supernatural connections? Unusual business partners? Meetings that happened under the full moon? The questions seemed insane, but the deadly seriousness in his expression told her this wasn't a joke. Seraphina's mind raced back through months of overheard conversations, late-night phone calls, mysterious meetings that Marcus had always dismissed as boring business stuff. There was something, she said slowly, the memory surfacing like a bubble from deep water. About 6 months ago, Marcus started meeting with a man who only came around at night. Pavel something, he had an accent, Russian maybe. They always met in Marcus's private study, and afterward, Marcus would be different. More aggressive. More violent. Kieran and Raven exchanged a look that spoke volumes. Pavel Volkov, Kieran said grimly. Alpha of the Eastern Pack. He's been trying to expand his territory into the city for years. The casual mention of alphas and packs sent another chill down Seraphina's spine, but she forced herself to continue. The night I left, she whispered, the memory making her hands shake, I heard them talking about some kind of exchange. Marcus kept saying, the girl, would be enough to seal their alliance. Kieran's expression turned murderous, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was planning to trade you, he said, his voice barely human. Like cattle. The realization hit Seraphina like a physical blow. She hadn't just been running from an abusive husband, she'd been fleeing from something far worse than she'd ever imagined. As if sensing her thoughts, Kieran moved to her side, his presence both comforting and terrifying. That will never happen, he said, his words carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow. I'll die before I let anyone use you as a bargaining chip. Chapter 3, Revelations in the Dark. That evening, Seraphina found herself alone in Kieran's apartment while he attended what he called urgent pack business. The words no longer seemed metaphorical, and her mind churned with possibilities too wild to believe yet too consistent to ignore. She wandered through the penthouse like a ghost, touching expensive objects and staring out at the city lights while trying to make sense of her new reality. The locked doors seemed to mock her, hiding secrets she wasn't ready to learn but desperately needed to understand. When she finally heard the elevator chime announcing Kieran's return, her heart rate spiked with a mixture of relief and anticipation. But instead of Kieran's familiar footsteps, she heard hushed voices echoing from the private elevator that led to his office, a space she'd never been allowed to enter. Curiosity overrode caution as she crept closer to the partially open door, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. The conversation was muffled, but she could make out Kieran's distinctive voice speaking in low, urgent tones. Something about the cadence made her blood run cold. This wasn't the gentle, protective man she'd come to know. This voice carried an edge of calculation that made her skin crawl. The conditioning is working perfectly, Kieran was saying, his words crisp and clinical. She trusts me completely now. The trauma bonding has exceeded even my projections. Seraphina pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he'd hear it. Conditioning? Trauma bonding? The term sounded like something from a psychology textbook, not a conversation between lovers. Marcus never suspected I was the one who suggested he hire Pavel's mercenaries, Kieran continued, and ice flooded Seraphina's veins. The beauty of it is that every escalation drove her deeper into my arms. She'll never question why I was in that alley at exactly the right moment. The world tilted sideways as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami. Every tender moment, every protective gesture, every time he'd held her while she cried about Marcus's abuse, it had all been orchestrated. Planned. Calculated down to the smallest detail. The man she'd fallen in love with had been playing a game so complex and cruel that it made Marcus's straightforward brutality seem almost honest by comparison. Her legs threatened to give out as she gripped the doorframe, fighting to remain upright while her entire reality crumbled around her. The girl believes herself to be falling in love. Kieran's voice drifted through the crack in the door, each word a dagger to her heart. Classic Stockholm Syndrome, though she doesn't realize it yet. Every rescue reinforces her dependence on me. Every moment of safety I provide creates deeper emotional bonds that will be impossible to break. There was a pause, then a sound that might have been laughter, cold and devoid of any warmth she'd thought she'd heard in his voice before. She actually thanked me for saving her life. If she only knew I was the one who put her in danger in the first place. Seraphina stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. The elegant penthouse that had felt like a sanctuary now felt like an elaborate cage, every luxury a bar designed to keep her compliant and grateful. The man she'd trusted with her deepest fears and vulnerabilities had been manipulating those very emotions to serve his own mysterious agenda. She thought of every time she'd melted into his arms, every kiss they'd shared, every whispered word of love, all of it tainted now by the knowledge that it had been performance art of the cruelest kind. Phase 2 begins tomorrow, Kieran was saying, and his voice carried a satisfaction that made her stomach turn. Once she's completely dependent on me emotionally, we can move to the next stage. The genetic testing will confirm what we suspect about her bloodline, and then we'll have everything we need to present to the council. Genetic testing? Bloodline? The words swirled in her head like poisonous smoke, adding new layers of horror to an already incomprehensible betrayal. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance, she was a specimen, something to be studied and manipulated for purposes she couldn't begin to understand. The sound of approaching footsteps sent panic shooting through her nervous system. Seraphina fled on silent feet, her mind racing as she tried to process what she'd heard while simultaneously planning her escape. But even as she moved, a terrible realization settled over her like a shroud. If Kieran had orchestrated her initial rescue, if he had that much control over Marcus and the supernatural forces hunting her, then nowhere would truly be safe. He'd proven he could manipulate events on a scale that defied comprehension. How could she possibly outrun someone with that kind of power and reach? She made it back to her room just as the elevator chimed again, this time announcing what sounded like Kieran's departure rather than arrival. The apartment fell into silence, but it was the kind of quiet that felt pregnant with danger rather than peace. Seraphina sank onto the bed, her hands shaking as she tried to make sense of the fragments of conversation she'd overheard. Council. Bloodline. Genetic testing. Phase 2. The words felt like pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve, each one revealing a larger picture that grew more terrifying with every connection she made. An hour later, when Kieran finally returned for real, Seraphina had managed to compose herself enough to appear normal, or at least, she hoped she had. The skills Marcus had beaten into her, the ability to hide her true feelings behind a mask of compliance, served her now in ways she'd never imagined they would. When Kieran emerged from the elevator looking like he'd been through a war, his usually pristine shirt torn and stained with something dark, his knuckles bloodied, she forced herself to react with concern rather than the revulsion and terror churning in her stomach. "What happened?" she whispered, proud that her voice only trembled slightly. But as she watched him move to the bar and pour himself whiskey, she found herself analyzing every gesture with new eyes. Was the exhaustion real, or was it another layer of performance? Were the injuries authentic, or carefully applied makeup designed to reinforce his image as her protector? The uncertainty was almost worse than the knowledge of his deception, because it meant she could trust nothing, not her eyes, not her instincts, not the evidence of her own senses. Marcus sent a message, Kieran said, and even knowing what she knew, the pain in his voice sounded genuine. 6 of my people are in the hospital because of it. The guilt that crashed over her felt automatic, programmed by weeks of careful conditioning. Even with the knowledge of his manipulation fresh in her mind, her first instinct was still to blame herself, to feel responsible for the violence that followed in her wake. The realization of how thoroughly he'd rewired her responses was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire nightmare. "This is my fault," she heard herself say, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I never should have involved you. I should leave." The script felt familiar, worn smooth by repetition, and she wondered how many times they'd had this exact conversation. How many times had he maneuvered her into feeling guilty, only to swoop in with comfort and reassurance that bound her more tightly to him. The pattern was so clear now that she couldn't believe she'd missed it before. Before she could finish the thought, Kieran was across the room, his hands framing her face with that familiar gentleness that now felt like mockery. "Don't," he said, and the firmness in his voice made her skin crawl. "Don't you dare blame yourself for the actions of monsters." His thumbs brushed away tears she didn't realize had started falling, and she had to fight every instinct not to recoil from his touch. "You're not responsible for Marcus's choices. You're not responsible for what he's become." The tenderness in his voice that had once made her feel cherished now felt like poison honey, sweet on the surface but deadly underneath. "What is he, Kieran?" she asked, leaning into his touch despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. But even as she played her part in their twisted dance, her mind was cataloging details, looking for weaknesses, planning for the moment when she could break free from whatever web he'd woven around her. "What are you?" The question carried new weight now, loaded with implications she was only beginning to understand. What kind of creature could orchestrate such elaborate psychological manipulation? What kind of monster could make someone fall in love with their own captor? For a long moment, he was silent, and she found herself studying his face with forensic intensity. Was the conflict she saw there genuine, or was he simply deciding how much truth to reveal? How many layers of deception were there to uncover? The realization that she might never know what was real and what was performance made her feel sick to her stomach. "Have you ever wondered why some people seem to carry darkness with them?" he asked quietly, and she noted how he deflected her direct question with one of his own. "Why certain individuals can command a room just by walking into it?" Kieran moved to the windows, and she watched his reflection in the glass like a scientist observing a dangerous specimen. "There are things in this world that exist in the spaces between human understanding," he continued, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality that had once made her feel safe but now made her want to cover her ears. "Ancient bloodlines. Old magic. Creatures that your ancestors knew to fear but your generation has forgotten." Lightning flickered outside, and she wondered if even the storm was part of his elaborate staging. How much of her reality had he constructed? How deep did his manipulation go? "Marcus isn't just a corrupt businessman, Seraphina," Kieran said, turning back to her with those amber eyes that no longer seemed warm but predatory. "He's something else entirely. Something that sees you as prey." The irony wasn't lost on her, warning her about predators while being the most dangerous one in the room. When lightning flashed again, she could have sworn his eyes reflected the light like an animal's, and the sight sent ice through her veins. "And so am I," he added softly, his words hanging in the air like a confession and a warning rolled into one. But now she understood that even this revelation was calculated, designed to make her feel like he was being honest with her while still controlling exactly what information she received. The confession of his supernatural nature was probably just another tool in his arsenal, another way to make her feel special and chosen while keeping her trapped in his carefully constructed reality. As she looked into those inhuman eyes, Seraphina made a silent vow: whatever game Kieran Nightshade was playing, whatever he needed her for, she would find a way to turn the tables. The helpless victim he thought he'd created was about to become his worst nightmare. The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows like tears from a wounded sky. But inside the penthouse, a different kind of storm was brewing, one born of betrayal and rage and the terrible knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous monsters were the ones who convinced you they were your salvation. Seraphina smiled at Kieran, the expression feeling like shattered glass on her face, and began planning her revenge. The storm outside mirrored the tempest in Seraphina's chest as Kieran's words sank in. "What do you mean, so am I?" she whispered, though part of her already knew the answer. Kieran's smile was sad and sharp, like a blade wrapped in silk. He moved with that predatory grace to a cabinet she'd never seen him open, withdrawing a small, ornate mirror. "Look at me," he said simply, "and tell me what you see." The request seemed innocent enough, but when Seraphina raised the mirror and angled it to show Kieran's reflection, her blood turned to ice. His amber eyes weren't just glowing, they were blazing with an inner fire that no human could possess. "I am what your kind calls a werewolf," Kieran said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his revelation. "Alpha of the Midnight Pack, protector of this territory, and the only thing standing between you and forces that would use you for purposes darker than you can imagine." The mirror slipped from Seraphina's nerveless fingers, shattering on the marble floor like her understanding of reality. 7 pieces of glass reflected 7 different angles of the impossible truth, each shard showing her a world she'd never known existed. "That's why Marcus wants you back so badly," Kieran continued. "Not just because of his obsession, but because you're—" A crash from the building's lower floors cut off his words, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass and screaming. Kieran's entire body went rigid, his nostrils flaring as he scented the air. "They're here," he growled, and the sound was definitely not human. The lights went out suddenly, plunging the penthouse into darkness broken only by the storm's lightning. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in hellish red as alarms began wailing throughout the building. "Stay behind me," Kieran commanded, his voice carrying an authority that made her bones vibrate. "Whatever happens, don't run. Running triggers their hunting instincts." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seraphina could see dark shapes scaling the outside of the building with impossible speed and agility. Her rational mind tried to reject what her eyes were telling her, but the evidence was undeniable. These weren't human intruders. They moved wrong, bent wrong, their limbs too long and their movements too fluid. "Marcus's mercenaries," Kieran said grimly, shrugging out of his torn shirt to reveal a torso mapped with old battle scars. "They're not entirely human anymore. Pavel Volkov's bite can turn men into something between wolf and man, creatures with the worst instincts of both species." The penthouse's reinforced windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and wind as 3 figures crashed through simultaneously. They were grotesque parodies of humanity, too tall, with elongated limbs and faces that were caught somewhere between human and beast. Their eyes glowed yellow in the emergency lighting, and when they snarled, Seraphina could see rows of sharp, pointed teeth. "Hello, little mouse," one of them said in a voice like grinding stone. "Time to come home." But before they could take another step, Kieran stepped forward, and the transformation that overtook him was the most beautiful and terrifying thing Seraphina had ever witnessed. His bones cracked and reformed, his muscles bulged and shifted, and when he threw back his head and roared, the sound was pure predator, ancient and unstoppable and absolutely magnificent. Chapter 4, Blood and Moonlight. The battle that erupted in Kieran's penthouse was like nothing from any movie or nightmare. Kieran, now something between man and wolf, standing nearly 8 feet tall with claws that gleamed like silver blades, moved with lethal grace that defied belief. His partially transformed state was terrifying and beautiful, muscles rippling beneath skin that seemed to shimmer between human and something far more primal. But as his transformation began, something unprecedented happened to Seraphina. A pull unlike anything she'd ever experienced tugged at her very essence, as if invisible threads were being drawn taut between her soul and something ancient and powerful that had been sleeping in her blood. Her vision sharpened with supernatural clarity, every detail of the battle becoming crystal clear despite the chaos. She could smell things she'd never noticed before, the metallic tang of spilled blood, the wild musk of predators, and underneath it all, something that smelled like moonlight and starfire. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but not just from fear. There was something else, something that felt like recognition, like coming home to a place she'd never known she'd left. When the first mercenary lunged at Kieran, his claws raking across the creature's chest and sending it flying into the marble wall with bone-crushing force, Seraphina felt her own muscles coil with an instinctive understanding of the violence unfolding before her. The scent of blood filled the air, metallic and hot, mixing with something wilder that made Seraphina's instincts scream both danger and safety simultaneously. But beneath those surface reactions, something deeper was stirring. Her bones began to ache with a strange, pulling sensation, as if they were trying to reshape themselves. Her fingernails, which she'd always kept short and practical, suddenly felt too small, too blunt for purposes she couldn't name but somehow understood. When she pressed her palms against the wall behind her, she could have sworn she felt her nails elongate slightly, becoming sharper, more predatory. The remaining two attackers circled Kieran like the predators they were, but he was clearly the apex predator in this fight. "You should have stayed in Pavel's territory," Kieran growled, his voice deeper and rougher than any human throat could produce. "Now you die in mine." As his words echoed through the penthouse, Seraphina felt an answering growl building in her own chest, a sound that definitely didn't belong to any human woman. She clapped her hand over her mouth in shock, but the vibration continued, thrumming through her bones like the echo of some primal song she'd been born knowing but had forgotten until this moment. The words were barely finished before Kieran moved, faster than anything should be able to move, catching one mercenary by the throat and lifting him off the ground. The creature's claws raked across Kieran's ribs, drawing lines of blood, but Kieran's grip never wavered. With a sound like breaking branches, he ended the threat permanently. As the mercenary's body hit the floor, Seraphina felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door that had been sealed her entire life suddenly swinging wide. Power flooded through her veins, ancient and wild and absolutely terrifying in its intensity. Her reflection in the shattered window caught her attention, and she gasped at what she saw. Her eyes, which had always been an unremarkable brown, were now glowing with silver light, not the warm amber of Kieran's wolf eyes, but something cooler, more ethereal, like captured moonbeams. Her pupils had elongated slightly, becoming more cat-like, and when she opened her mouth in shock, she glimpsed teeth that were definitely sharper than they had been moments before. This wasn't just adrenaline or fear-induced hallucination. Something fundamental was changing in her body, awakening after years of dormancy. Seraphina pressed herself against the far wall, but now it wasn't just to stay out of the way of the battle. She was fighting a transformation of her own, pushing down instincts that screamed at her to join the fight, to protect her territory, to show these intruders what happened when they threatened what belonged to her. The rational part of her mind insisted this was impossible. She was human, had always been human, had never shown any sign of supernatural abilities. But her body was telling a different story, one written in genetic memory and bloodline magic that had been suppressed but never truly erased. The last mercenary seemed to realize it was outmatched, backing toward the shattered windows with yellow eyes fixed on her. "The girl comes with us," it snarled, "or Pavel will hunt every member of your pack to extinction." But as its gaze locked with hers, something shifted in its expression. Fear flickered across its inhuman features, not fear of Kieran, but fear of her. It could sense what she was becoming, could smell the power awakening in her blood, and it knew that it was facing something far more dangerous than a simple human woman caught in supernatural crossfire. Kieran's laugh was like distant thunder, dark and promising storms. "Let him try," he said, advancing with predatory patience. "I've been looking forward to adding his hide to my collection." But his voice seemed distant now, muffled by the roaring in Seraphina's ears as her transformation fought to complete itself. She could feel her bones trying to lengthen, her muscles attempting to reshape themselves, her very DNA rewriting itself according to patterns that had been hidden in her cells since birth. The pain was extraordinary, but underneath it was a sense of rightness, of finally becoming what she was always meant to be. The final confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds, but for Seraphina, it felt like an eternity of fighting against her own changing nature. The mercenary made the mistake of trying to reach her, and as it moved in her direction, every protective instinct in her body exploded into action. She didn't consciously decide to move, her body simply acted, flowing into a defensive stance she'd never learned but somehow knew perfectly. Her hand came up in a gesture that should have been futile against a supernatural predator, but when her fingers made contact with the creature's chest, silver light erupted from her palm. The mercenary flew backward as if hit by a freight train, its body slamming into the already cracked wall with enough force to leave an impact crater in the reinforced concrete. Kieran's protective instincts had exploded into violence that was swift and absolute, but Seraphina's intervention had been something else entirely, pure, concentrated power that spoke of bloodlines far older than the werewolf packs that dominated the supernatural world. When the silence finally fell, broken only by the sound of rain through the destroyed windows, both Kieran and Seraphina stood among the carnage, staring at each other in shock. Slowly, Kieran's form began to shift back toward human, bones and muscles rearranging themselves with sounds that should have been horrifying but somehow felt natural. But Seraphina's transformation was fighting to go in the opposite direction, her partially awakened heritage pushing against her human disguise like a butterfly trying to emerge from a chrysalis. She could feel her canine teeth extending into fangs, could sense her spine trying to elongate, could feel power coursing through her veins like liquid starlight. When Kieran turned to face her, his amber eyes still glowing, the expression in them was one of complete bewilderment. "What are you?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from his own transformation. The question that should have been directed at him had somehow reversed, and now he was staring at her as if she were the impossible creature in the room. Blood from various wounds painted his torso, but he seemed oblivious to his own injuries, completely focused on the silver light that still flickered around her fingers like captured lightning. "Your eyes," he continued, taking a step closer despite the obvious wariness in his posture. "They're not glowing like a werewolf's. They're something else entirely." Seraphina stared down at her hands, watching the silver light dance across her skin like living things. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice trembling with shock and confusion. "I don't know what's happening to me." But even as she spoke, fragments of suppressed memories were beginning to surface. Her mother's unusual strength, her father's uncanny ability to sense danger, the way both of them had always seemed to know things they shouldn't have known. The car accident that had killed them when she was 8 years old suddenly seemed less like random tragedy and more like targeted assassination. "You're not human," Kieran said, the words carrying weight and wonder and a touch of something that might have been fear. "You never were. That's why Marcus wanted you so badly, not just as a possession, but as a breeder. Your bloodline." He trailed off, his eyes widening as pieces of a larger puzzle clicked into place. "Moon blessed," he breathed, the words falling from his lips like a prayer or a curse. "You're one of the moon blessed. I thought your kind was extinct." The term sent shockwaves through Seraphina's awakening consciousness, unlocking genetic memories that had been buried for decades. Images flashed through her mind, wolves that ran beneath silver light, beings that could channel the power of the moon itself, a people who had been hunted to near extinction because their abilities made them too dangerous to allow to exist. "My parents," she whispered, the truth hitting her like a physical blow. "They weren't killed in a car accident. They were murdered." Kieran nodded grimly, his expression dark with old knowledge and older guilt. The moon blessed were systematically eliminated 50 years ago by a coalition of supernatural factions who feared their power. Your parents must have hidden you among humans, suppressed your abilities somehow, kept you safe by making you forget what you really were. His gaze intensified, studying her with new understanding. But transformations like mine can trigger awakening in dormant bloodlines. That's why your abilities are manifesting now. Being in close proximity to my wolf has been slowly breaking down whatever barriers your parents put in place. The revelation explained so much. Her instant connection to Kieran, her inexplicable trust in someone she barely knew, the way supernatural danger had seemed to follow her even before Marcus's abuse had escalated. She hadn't been a random victim caught in supernatural politics. She'd been a target from the moment she'd been born, and Marcus's obsession with her had been driven by instincts he probably didn't even understand. "He could sense what I was," she said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "Even if he didn't consciously know it, some part of him recognized my bloodline." "Moon-blessed can bear children with any supernatural species," Kieran explained, his voice heavy with implications. "But the offspring carry abilities that surpass both parent bloodlines. Marcus wanted to breed with you not just for possession, but for power. A child with your genetics and his werewolf blood would be..." He paused, searching for words adequate to describe such a prospect. "Unprecedented. Possibly unstoppable." Seraphina felt sick to her stomach as the full scope of Marcus's plans became clear. She hadn't just been running from an abusive husband, she'd been fleeing from someone who wanted to use her body as a weapon factory, to create supernatural soldiers that could dominate any opposition. The thought of bearing children under such circumstances, of bringing beings into the world specifically to be weapons of war, made her entire body revolt. "That's why you've been protecting me," she said, looking at Kieran with new understanding. "Not just from kindness, but because you know what I am." Kieran's expression was unreadable as he considered her words. "I suspected," he admitted. "Your scent was unusual. There were signs that suggested non-human heritage, but I thought you might be a distant werewolf descendant with dormant traits. I never imagined you were moon-blessed. If I had..." He trailed off, conflict playing across his features. "Everything would have been different. The level of protection you require, the enemies you'll face now that your abilities are awakening, it's beyond anything I initially prepared for." "Are you afraid of me?" Seraphina asked, watching silver light continue to dance around her fingers like captured starfire. The power felt natural now that it had awakened, like breathing or walking, something she'd always been capable of but had simply never accessed. "Should you be?" The questions hung in the air between them, loaded with implications for their relationship and their future. She was no longer the helpless human he'd rescued from an alley. She was something potentially more powerful than him, something that other supernatural beings would kill to control or eliminate. Kieran's smile was slow and genuine, the first truly unguarded expression she'd seen from him since her awakening began. "Terrified," he admitted freely. "And amazed. And honored to witness your transformation." He stepped closer, seemingly unconcerned by the power radiating from her skin. "Moon-blessed are legendary for their strength, their wisdom, their ability to bring peace between warring supernatural factions. If you're truly awakening, if your abilities fully manifest, you could change everything about how our world operates. But first," he added, his expression growing serious, "we need to keep you alive long enough to learn control. Because every supernatural faction in the world is going to want either to recruit you or eliminate you, and until you master your abilities, you're more vulnerable than you've ever been." The weight of prophecy and responsibility settled on Seraphina's shoulders like a mantle she'd never asked for but could no longer avoid. As she looked into Kieran's amber eyes, she realized that her journey was just beginning, and the path ahead would test every aspect of who she was becoming. Chapter 5, The Choice. "Because," Seraphina said, stepping over broken glass and debris to reach him, "for the first time since I left Marcus, I feel safe." Her words seemed to hit Kieran harder than any of the claws that had raked his skin. He stood motionless as she approached, his amber eyes tracking her every movement with an intensity that should have been frightening but felt like coming home. The silver light still flickered around her fingers from her awakened abilities, but she noticed how Kieran's gaze focused on her face rather than the supernatural power dancing across her skin. When she reached up to touch a particularly deep gash on his shoulder, he flinched, not from pain, but from the gentleness of her touch. "I don't understand any of this," she continued, her fingers tracing the edge of his wound with newfound confidence that came from accepting her supernatural heritage. "But I understand you. You could have killed me a dozen times over, but instead you've protected me. Whatever you are, Kieran Nightshade, you're not the monster. The words carried new weight now that she knew what she was, now that she understood the supernatural world wasn't divided simply between predators and prey. Her moon-blessed bloodline meant she was neither helpless victim nor mindless killer. She was something else entirely, something that could choose its own path. The sound of approaching sirens and helicopter rotors filled the night air, but Kieran seemed oblivious to everything except her touch. "You should be terrified," he said hoarsely, his voice rough from his transformation back to human form. "I just killed 3 beings in front of you. I'm not human, Seraphina. The darkness in me runs deeper than you can possibly imagine." His hands came up to cover hers, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers. This powerful, impossible man was shaking because of her acceptance. "I've done things that would haunt your dreams. I've made choices that paint me as the villain in any rational person's story." But even as he spoke, Seraphina was processing everything that had happened through the lens of her new understanding. The mercenaries hadn't just been after her as Marcus's escaped wife, they'd been hunting the last of the moon-blessed bloodline. Kieran's protection hadn't been motivated solely by attraction or even supernatural politics. He'd been safeguarding something precious and irreplaceable, a piece of supernatural history that most believed extinct. The realization shifted her perspective on everything, including the way she viewed their growing connection. "Then it's a good thing I'm not rational," Seraphina said, rising on her toes to press her forehead against his. The silver light around her fingers pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, responding to her emotional state in ways she was only beginning to understand. Rational would have been staying with Marcus. Rational would have been accepting that I deserved the abuse. Rational would have been giving up months ago. The connection between them crackled with electricity that was both supernatural and deeply personal, and she could feel something changing in the air around them, as if reality itself was shifting to accommodate this moment between 2 beings who had found each other across impossible odds. "I've spent my entire life being afraid, Kieran," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of trusting the wrong person, afraid of my own shadow. But with you, the fear is different. It's not the fear of being hurt, it's the fear of not being brave enough to choose love over safety." As she spoke, memories of her parents flickered through her awakening consciousness, fragments of a time when she'd felt safe and loved and protected by people who understood what she truly was. Kieran's presence evoked those same feelings, but deeper, more intense, colored by adult understanding and supernatural connection. Kieran's breath caught at her words, and for a moment she saw the vulnerable man beneath the alpha exterior. "Love?" he whispered, the word carrying weight and wonder and desperate hope. The question hung between them like a bridge spanning 2 different worlds, his of ancient bloodlines and pack politics, hers of awakening power and rediscovered heritage. But somehow, impossibly, they'd found common ground in the space between those worlds, a place where love could flourish despite the supernatural forces trying to tear them apart. Seraphina smiled, her heart hammering against her ribs as she made a choice that would alter the trajectory of her entire existence. "I love you," she said simply, the words infused with silver light that made them visible in the air between them for a split second. "I love your gentleness and your strength. I love how you make me feel protected without making me feel powerless. I love that you're dangerous enough to keep me safe but controlled enough to never hurt me. I don't care what you are, Kieran. I care who you are." The declaration felt like a spell being cast, binding them together across species lines and supernatural politics. The kiss that followed was electric, desperate, and transformative. Kieran's lips were warm and urgent against hers, tasting of mint and danger and promises she was only beginning to understand. Silver light danced between them as their supernatural natures recognized and accepted each other, werewolf strength meeting moon-blessed power in perfect harmony. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Seraphina felt fundamentally changed, not just by her awakening abilities, but by the choice to trust someone completely despite the risks involved. But their moment of connection was shattered by a weak voice from the debris. One of the mercenaries Kieran had supposedly killed was still alive, blood frothing from its mouth as it struggled to speak. "Your brother," it gasped, yellow eyes fixed on Kieran with malicious satisfaction, "sends his regards." The words hit the room like a physical blow, and Seraphina felt Kieran's entire body go rigid beside her. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as something dark and dangerous flickered across his features. "What did you say?" Kieran's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of calm that preceded violence. But there was something else in his tone, shock, betrayal, and a pain so deep it made Seraphina's chest ache in sympathy. The mercenary's laugh was wet and ugly, blood spattering from its lips as it savored its final moments of revenge. "Damon always said you were too soft for leadership," it continued, each word carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. "Too willing to compromise. Too quick to show mercy to inferior species." Seraphina felt ice forming in her stomach as the implications began to sink in. Kieran had a brother. A brother who apparently disagreed with his methods and leadership style. A brother who was powerful enough to orchestrate attacks against the Night Alpha himself. The girl was never the real prize, the dying mercenary wheezed, its gaze shifting between Kieran and Seraphina with cruel satisfaction. She was just the bait. The perfect test to prove that the great Night Alpha has gone weak, choosing humans over pack law. "You're lying," Kieran snarled, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he feared the mercenary was telling the truth. Damon wouldn't, but he cut himself off, conflict warring across his features as memories and suspicions that had apparently been building for some time finally coalesced into horrible clarity. The mercenary's smile was triumphant despite its approaching death. "He's been planning this for months. Every attack, every escalation, every moment that forced you to choose between pack loyalty and protecting her, all of it designed to prove to the council that you're unfit to lead." Seraphina watched in horror as Kieran's face went through a series of expressions: denial, realization, fury, and finally a grief so profound it seemed to age him decades in moments. "The council meeting," he whispered, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "Next week's gathering. He's going to challenge my leadership." His hands clenched into fists, claws extending slightly as his control began to slip. "He's been building a case against me, using my protection of you as evidence that I've lost perspective, that I'm no longer capable of putting pack interests first." "But why?" Seraphina asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Supernatural politics were apparently as brutal and complex as their human counterparts, with family bonds meaning little when power was at stake. The mercenary's breathing was growing more labored, but it seemed determined to deliver its message completely. "Because leadership of the Night Pack means controlling the most powerful werewolf territory in North America," it gasped. "And because Damon believes in the old ways. Pure bloodlines. Supernatural supremacy. No mixing with inferior species." The insult to her humanity, or what she'd thought was her humanity, should have stung, but Seraphina found herself more concerned with the devastation she could see in Kieran's eyes. This betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound, striking at the heart of his identity and his ability to trust. "How long?" Kieran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has my brother been working against me?" The mercenary's smile was cruel and satisfied. "Since the moment you showed interest in the human woman. Damon saw opportunity in your weakness." "I'm not human," Seraphina said firmly, silver light flaring around her as anger sparked her abilities. "I'm moon-blessed. And Kieran isn't weak for protecting me, he's honorable." The mercenary's expression shifted to one of shock and fear as it finally registered what she was, what kind of power was awakening in the woman it had dismissed as an inferior species. But it was too late for revelations to change anything. With a final, rattling breath, the creature died, leaving behind silence heavy with the weight of betrayal and looming conflict. Kieran stood motionless for a long moment, processing the implications of everything they'd learned. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow with grief and rage. "My twin brother," he said quietly. My blood. The one person I trusted above all others. His laugh was bitter and sharp. He's been using Marcus, using Pavel, using your suffering as weapons against me. Every moment of pain you endured, every night you spent running in terror, it was all part of his plan to prove I was unfit to lead. The sound of approaching sirens was getting closer, but neither of them moved toward escape. The revelation of Damon's betrayal had shifted everything, turning their story from one of rescue and romance into something darker and more complex. What happens now? Seraphina asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. Kieran's expression hardened, the grief in his eyes crystallizing into something that looked like determination forged in fire. Now, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute resolve, we prepare for war. Because my brother has made one critical mistake in his calculations. His amber eyes met hers, and she saw both love and lethal purpose burning in their depths. He assumed that loving you made me weak. But protecting the last of the moon-blessed bloodline doesn't diminish my strength, it multiplies it. When the council convenes, they'll see exactly what kind of alpha I am when everything I care about is threatened. The kiss they shared this time was different. Still passionate, but underlaid with the grim knowledge that their love had become a weapon in a supernatural war they'd never asked to fight. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sound of voices in the hallway reminded them that their immediate safety was still in jeopardy. We have to go, Kieran said reluctantly, his protective instincts warring with the need to begin planning for the challenge ahead. My people will handle the cleanup, but we can't be here when the authorities arrive. He was already moving, grabbing clothes and essentials with practiced efficiency, but Seraphina could see the way his mind was racing, processing strategies and contingencies for a conflict that would determine not just his leadership but the future of supernatural politics in North America. Where? She asked, following him toward what appeared to be a hidden elevator she'd never noticed. The question carried more weight now. They weren't just fleeing immediate danger, but seeking a place where she could learn to master her awakening abilities while Kieran prepared to defend his position against his own blood. Kieran's smile was sharp and promising, but tinged with the darkness of coming conflict. Somewhere Marcus and Pavel will never find you, he said, his voice carrying undertones of steel and determination. Somewhere you can learn what it truly means to be protected by a pack that's about to go to war. As they stepped into the hidden elevator, Seraphina realized that their journey was far from over. If anything, the revelation of Damon's betrayal marked the beginning of a new chapter, one written in blood and moonlight, where love would be tested by forces that sought to tear apart everything they'd built together. The elevator began its descent into darkness, carrying them toward an uncertain future where the stakes had just become impossibly higher. But as Seraphina felt Kieran's hand squeeze hers, silver light dancing between their intertwined fingers, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The moon blessed and the night alpha, bound by love and threatened by betrayal, descending into a war that would reshape the supernatural world forever. 3 weeks later, Seraphina stood on the balcony of Kieran's mountain stronghold, watching the sun set over the forest that stretched endlessly in every direction. The Midnight Pack's headquarters was carved into the mountainside itself, a fortress of stone and steel that felt more like a sanctuary than a hiding place. She'd learned so much in those 3 weeks that her old life felt like someone else's story. The pack members who'd initially viewed her with suspicion now treated her with protective affection, especially after Kieran had formally declared her under his protection. The phrase, Alpha's mate, was whispered with reverence, though Kieran himself had never used those words. Marcus's empire had crumbled spectacularly in their absence. The flash drive's contents, strategically leaked to the right journalists and federal agents, had triggered investigations that toppled his business partners like dominoes. Pavel Volkov had withdrawn his mercenaries and retreated to his eastern territory, apparently deciding that challenging Kieran wasn't worth the cost. According to Raven's intelligence network, Marcus himself had been arrested on charges ranging from money laundering to human trafficking. It's over, Kieran had told her that morning, pulling her close as they watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. He can't hurt you anymore. But even as Seraphina settled into her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the shadows. Kieran had been called away on pack business more frequently, and when he returned, there was tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. The other pack members exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking, and conversations stopped abruptly when she entered rooms. "There's something you're not telling me," she'd said to Kieran the night before, but he'd distracted her with kisses and whispered promises that everything would be fine. Tonight, as she stood alone on the balcony breathing in the crisp mountain air, Seraphina felt more at peace than she had in years. The scars from her marriage to Marcus were healing, replaced by the warm certainty of Kieran's love and the pack's protection. She'd found her place in this impossible world of werewolves and ancient magic, and for the first time since childhood, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. The sound of footsteps on stone made her turn, expecting to see Kieran returning from his meeting with the pack elders. Instead, she found herself face to face with an elderly woman whose silver hair gleamed like moonlight and whose eyes held depths of knowledge that seemed older than the mountains themselves. "Hello, dear," the woman said gently, her voice carrying accents from a dozen different countries. "My name is Lydia Ravencrest, and I'm afraid I have some rather shocking news about your heritage." The woman's smile was kind but tinged with sadness. "You see, my dear Seraphina, you're not entirely human yourself. Your bloodline carries secrets that certain people would kill for, and others would die to protect." As if summoned by her words, golden eyes began gleaming from the forest beyond, dozens of them, watching and waiting in the darkness. For the first time, Seraphina felt safe in Kieran's arms and accepted by his pack, but in the ancient depths of the mountain forest, another pair of golden eyes had already chosen her fate, and the game of supernatural politics had only just begun.